looking at the critical and contemporary issues facing the Muslim world from different perspectives, generating new ideas, bringing to you all this and a lot more in Voices from the Muslim World.
The state, governments are the most robust actors in sort of, advancing, fueling, driving societal Islamophobia. Citizenship Amendment Act in India, the CAA, is emblematic of structural Islamophobia. Is that, in my opinion, the American war on terror, right? This was the primary crusade that intensified global Islamophobia. The 9/11 terror attacks and the war on terror gave India, gave China, gave Myanmar, gave England, gave France, gave all these countries new license to intensify their persecution and crackdown on their Muslim communities.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Dr. Khaled Beydoun. Welcome to Istanbul and welcome to İLKE Foundation. Thank you for taking out time for us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Right. So before we move on, let's talk about what's going on these days. What are you up to?
Yeah. Oh, up to a lot. In terms of academic research and writing, I'm working on my third book, which is titled The New Crusades, Islamophobia as a Global Phenomenon, examining what's taking place all over the world with regard to Islamophobia.
So let's talk about Islamophobia here on.
Sure.
There are a lot of problems in the Muslim world, and they do include Islamophobia. But let's learn the rationale behind your motivation of working just on Islamophobia. Do you think it is the primary problem, or there was some other motivation that made you work on Islamophobia only?
Yeah, so I don't work on Islamophobia only, but what gave rise to my interest in the topic was I became a lawyer and then an academic during the war on terror, and I'd recognized very early on that there was little academic research on the demonization and the otherization of Muslims, first Muslims in the United States, but also Muslims, Muslims globally. So for me, I wanted to fill that intellectual void, specifically within legal academia. I'm a law professor, and I teach constitutional law primarily. So that was the primary motivation, and because I teach constitutional law, thinking about issues including religious freedom, free speech, organizing rights, so civil liberties, connecting that to how I theorize Islamophobia was the motivation.
Right. So if we say Islamophobia, it's a very familiar term, It appears very familiar to all of us. But still, it's also a fact that there are different connotations of this term.
Sure.
So if we request to understand from you, or if you request your understanding of this term, so if we had to explain what Islamophobia actually is, how would you explain it?
Yeah, so I think for me, that shallow understanding of what Islamophobia is what really motivated my decision to want to theorize and re-theorize what Islamophobia actually meant, connected to what was taking place with the domestic war on terror in the United States, but also the global war on terror as it expanded and unfolded. So for me, Islamophobia, above all, is state policy, right? Law, policy, state action on the part of government, something I call structural Islamophobia. Other academics call it state-sponsored Islamophobia. And that was the dimension of Islamophobia that was being neglected, if not entirely ignored, within popular discourses in the media, but also academic discourses. Academic and popular discourses tended to fixate on what I call private Islamophobia, which was, the hate mongering, the popular violence, the societal animus that was being inflicted by entities not connected to the state. And even though there was ample attention on private Islamophobia, academics and pundits we're not connecting it to what the state was doing. And that connection is the third dimension that I call dialectical Islamophobia. This ongoing, fluid, dynamic conversation that essentially takes place between state policy and state action, and how that state action emboldens, directs, and authorizes the private Islamophobia we see taking place globally. And obviously we're sitting here today with what's happening in India.
Right.
We see it taking place very lucidly over there right now.
Right. So, I mean, you have already mentioned the three types of Islamophobia, phobia, which you summarize normally. If I request you to shed some further light on them, like what do we exactly call personal or private Islamophobia?
Yeah.
And then Islamophobia, dialectical Islamophobia. And the third one is?
Structural.
Structural. So
Yeah.
how do we differentiate between them, or are they interconnected? Do they perpetuate each other?
Yeah, they definitely perpetuate each other, and we can think about it. We can think about them, I think, most effectively as being cyclical, right? So one of them catalyzing the other. Exactly. So that's why I think spearheading or leading with an understanding of structural Islamophobia is the best starting point, because in my opinion, the state, governments are the most robust actors in sort of, advancing, fueling, driving societal Islamophobia. We see that in populist movements in Europe. We see that in populist movements in Asia. How, laws, I'll give you an example. So the Citizenship Amendment Act in India, the CAA, is emblematic of structural Islamophobia. It's a law that essentially says that Muslims from three Muslim majority countries, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, cannot become naturalized citizens, right? So when the state passes a law like that, we see the dialectic, it's sort of spurring the idea that Muslims cannot become citizens because they are inassimilable, they are foreign, they are individuals who cannot become Indian. That communique that undergirds the law is essentially spurring the private Islamophobia. And the private Islamophobia is the vigilante violence, the mob violence, right? The attacks that are being committed by Hindutva thugs, and so on and so forth. That is intensified by the law, right? So, and that's why we can see how all of these three dimensions of Islamophobia are deeply interconnected.
But since you're a law professor, so let me ask a connected question as well.
Sure.
So is it more like that, most of your work focuses on structural Islamophobia?
Yeah.
Because it basically transmits through the laws that are structured and that discriminate between people, on the basis of their religion or on the basis of Islam. So is it so that, your work is more closely associated to that?
I would say so. I think that's a fair sort of assessment of my work. Yeah, given that I'm a law professor, for me, the law is always the most salient and the most sort of logical starting point for examining not only Islamophobia, but any mode of societal animus, racism, xenophobia, right? Laws are the most potent and powerful sort of instruments or tools that drive these forms of bigotry.
Right. And you have done a very marvelous work when it comes to your recent book, American Islamophobia. And you're actually, in simple words, provided a corpus for the discipline there, filling a niche which was left behind. But if I ask you, Islamophobia is not just restricted to United States.
Of course.
It's there in the politics of Europe.
Yeah.
You have just talked about Hindutva. So it's there in the East, it's there in the West, and obviously it's there in the United States as well. But what made you specifically write? Was there any rationale or motivation or any significant features of American Islamophobia differentiating it from the other ones that made you write specifically a book on American Islamophobia?
Yeah, good question. For me, when I was, and I've been, conducting academic research on national security, religious freedom, Islamophobia for roughly a decade now.
Right.
What drove my decision to write this book, American Islamophobia, was to produce a product that general audiences could read, because general audiences aren't reading academic articles, right? I want to write something that was accessible, and being that I'm a Muslim American, I'm an American law scholar, it seemed that the logical starting point would be to focus on a project on American Islamophobia before transitioning onto the far more ambitious project of making sense of what was happening on a global scale. So that's one reason I focused initially on American Islamophobia is the first book. The second reason I think that American Islamophobia makes sense as sort of a precedent step to examining global Islamophobia, which is the focus of my next book, inshallah, is that, in my opinion, the American War on Terror, right? This was the primary crusade that intensified global Islamophobia, right? It made possible, it didn't necessarily spawn, right? Because there were forms of Islamophobia that actually precede the 9/11 terror attacks and the American War on Terror.
Right.
France is an example. I think you can even count India as an example.
Exactly.
India had its own indigenous mode of anti-Muslim animus.
Back to 1980s. Even.
Exactly. Even the partition, one might even say,
Exactly.
right? So it predates the 9/11 terror attacks. But given that the United States was the lone global superpower at that time, right? The 9/11 terror attacks and then the War on Terror gave India, gave China, gave Myanmar, gave England, gave France, gave all these countries new license to intensify their persecution and crackdown on their Muslim communities.
Okay. So we've talked about the problem now and the part of the problem now.
Yep.
So let's move towards the solution. Since you have done this extensive 10 years research on the same topic of Islamophobia.
Mm-hmm.
So if I ask you, do you think there's a solution? Because, obviously, on one hand, there are world powers, they are structurally inflicting Islamophobia on the minorities. So do you think there are solutions to this problem, or there's a solution, a panacea to this problem? And secondly, an attached question, because there are different forms of Islamophobia. Let me give you an example. By first asking that, do you think the solutions to these different types of Islamophobia would also be different? So the problem, each problem with a different solution, like if it's private Islamophobia, obviously it has to do with the stereotype masses.
Mm-hmm.
So like, educating them. But when it comes to structural, it calls for the repealing of the laws. So obviously, so exactly. So my question is like, what is the panacea, and does the panacea or the solution change according to the type of Islamophobia we're facing?
Yeah, so I think that's an excellent observation. The idea that even though we have a global phenomenon that is Islamophobia, there are some, common connections between the forms of Islamophobia that are unfolding on a global scale. But there are some critical distinctions, right? The distinctions are driven by the political, the societal, and I think most importantly, the governmental context that we're talking about. So the solutions for structural Islamophobia in China are dramatically different than the possible solutions for the structural Islamophobia in the United States. In the United States, there were successful lawsuits.
They're easily accessible in the United States.
Well, yeah, what do you mean by easily accessible?
The repealing of the laws may be easier in the United States than in China.
Maybe not practically easier, but theoretically possible, right? Depending on the form of government in place. Because in the United States, there are staunch Islamophobic elements, specifically within the Republican Party, right? So if they're in power, it's harder to repeal these laws. But it's easier to challenge them legally speaking. So I'll give you an example. So in the United States, there's a policy. You spent time in the UK, so are you familiar with Prevent? Counter-radicalization policing.
Exactly.
There was a similar program in the United States in the tri-state area, New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania.
That was steered by?
That was steered by NYPD, New York Police Department. And there was a successful lawsuit launched by a nonprofit organization that found that policing program was unconstitutional on religious freedom grounds. So it was struck down. So, but if we go to China, on the other hand, right, democratic country, the United States, at least theoretically speaking, China, authoritarian communist regime, you can't use the legal channels to challenge digital surveillance of Uyghur in Urumqi or in Hoten or in East Turkestan at large.
I think even digging down the extent of Islamophobia in China is difficult in the first place.
Yeah, and I think the other layer is that when I speak to general audiences, the first step is they don't understand what's happening in China or East Turkestan. Second, they don't frame it within the prism of Islamophobia. That is something I'm trying to do in my work, is to say that this is a form of Islamophobia that we have to analyze as such.
I understand. So we have talked about the countries specifically where Muslims live in minority generally.
Yeah.
Be it UK, be it United States,
The
be it
West.
China, West and East both, you know, like wherever there is, I mean, even if you talk about East Timor, like, you know,
Mhm.
or some other examples like Rohingya. So no matter what place is it,
Yeah.
it's mostly, you know, our examples, they are of minorities. So despite Muslims being in, like, you know, around 200 million in India,
220, yeah.
to 220 million in India, still of the whole population, they make a minority.
Yeah.
So what about the Islamophobia? Because, you know, I have seen some researches recently, more recently, about Islamophobia in the Muslim majority countries.
Yeah.
So is there any Islamophobia as such in the Muslim majority countries? What is it like, you know? Is there any in the
Yeah,
first
you know,
place?
I'm asked this question quite often, and I grapple with whether it is Islamophobia or whether it is sort of a you know, state demonization of Islamist political movements. You know, we were talking earlier today off camera about North Africa, right?
Yeah.
North African regimes are largely driven by military, monarchical, or some form of authoritarian governments that might lean secular, right? There's a rich tradition in the Arab world, even beyond North Africa, where secular regimes, Iraq would be an example, have been highly suspicious of Islamic or Muslim-oriented movements. So the marginalization and the over-policing of groups like the Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood, you know, in Egypt but beyond, is a sort of staple tenet of modern Arab world history. Is that Islamophobic? In part it might be, because governments are sort of classifying an entity based on its connection to Islam as being dangerous, suspicious, and one that looks, you know, seeking to topple their rule. I'm not sure if the intent is Islamophobic, but the consequence is, because what happens is that in places like Egypt, for example, individuals or communities that aren't part of the Ikhwan are sometimes suspected of being Ikhwani on grounds of religious piety, or which masajid they attend, or which family members they're connected to. I'm half Egyptian, and let me tell you, a lot of Egyptian families have an Ikhwani in their family,
Right.
even though they might not be
Ikhwanis
Ikhwanis themselves. But as a consequence of that association, they're guilty.
But you know, the reason I asked you this question was, this may be a grave issue itself, you know, which you have just explained, you know,
Yeah.
Islamophobia. But when we are talking specifically of Islamophobia in a certain context, does including these kind of things in Islamophobia do not make the actual Islamophobia more abstract?
Yeah, but I don't think making Islamophobia more abstract is necessarily a bad thing, especially as an academic exercise, right? So for me, I'm an academic, but I'm also a public scholar, right? So I have sort of two objectives, and reconciling these objectives sometimes is very difficult to navigate, right? I think as academics, it's important for us to theorize and, you know, sort of grapple with the ambiguity and the abstract when thinking about these terms, right? Because these terms are never fixed. Even my theorization of Islamophobia might change, and I welcome that it changes, right? But I think that from a public education standpoint, abstractness isn't always a great thing, because when we're communicating with lay audiences and general audiences who don't have the sort of familiarity with these terms, we have to make sure they fully understand the basic foundational idea before they transition into more abstract expansions of the concept.
Right. And you know, Dr. Khaled, we have talked about Islamophobia in different countries. But let me draw your attention toward another aspect or the facet of this problem.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there is Islamophobia in the United States, in United Kingdom, in Europe, in Germany, in India. Mm-hmm. But do you not think when you see the fight against the structural Islamophobia on the global level, do you not see the overall global war that is being waged against the Muslims when you see the selective nature of their response to when it's Islamophobia? I guess, like, you know, you can take the example of the response of the world on a whole on the Ukraine crisis and their apathy to, you know, like 50 and 70 years old problems like Palestine and Kashmir and Uyghurs.
Yeah, definitely, and I've written about this.
So is it not a systematic global war being waged against Muslims, not individual countries doing Islamophobia?
So there's two things going on, right? So to classify it as a war, I think is justifiable, especially because we're coming out of 2 decades of the war on terror, right? Where, you know, the most powerful government in the world, my own government in the United States, called it a war.
Yeah.
Presidents called it a crusade, right, against Islamic terror. But the reality was that they conflated Islamic terror with...
So we have talked about Islamophobia that is waged by individual countries. Islamophobia in United States, in Germany, in India, in Europe, in UK, and a lot of other countries. But when we see the response of the whole world, you know, against this Islamophobia, do you not think, or do you not understand from this that there is actually a global Islamophobia being waged against Muslims? And it is not only some countries that are having Islamophobia being waged against their communities.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a, you know, you might call it a war or a network of wars that was again, you know, spearheaded by, you know, American governmental and you know, administrations, starting with the Bush administration, leading up to the, you know, the current administration. Yeah, so a strategic and intentional campaign or campaigns to crack down on Muslim communities based upon this problematic conflation of Islam with terrorism, right? And the more somebody exhibited, you know, Muslim behaviors, Muslim identity, the stronger that the government's going to make that connection with terrorism. And we see that war, you know, ongoing in very violent ways, you know, in the West, but also beyond the West. So we have to think about this as a set of crusades which are looking to suppress Muslim communities in ways that are not being covered, like the war in Ukraine, for instance, right? Which marshals so much support from governments and, you know, mobilize so much attention in the media. That has not been the case with Muslim struggles of the same ilk.
True. Okay. And if I ask you specifically about your work, like, you know, let me first appreciate your work specifically on Kashmir issue against the Hindutva problem in India, as well as the Uyghurs, you know. I'll request you to, you know, shed some light on your works on these issues. Secondly, I would ask you, is it the gruesome nature of these problems that has made you select these problems out of all the geographical problems or the human problems, you know, human tragedies Muslim world is facing? Or is it the apathy of the world, specifically the Muslim world, that has made you select these regions?
Yeah, you know, for me, again, being an academic who studies Islamophobia, it was you know, I guess intellectually obligatory for me to sort of engage and then analyze what was happening on a global scale with this menace, just as purely an intellectual project and exercise. But beyond that, as a public thinker and intellectual, much of my motivation to address what was happening in these places was inspired by the fact that mainstream media outlets, specifically in the United States and the West at large, was neglecting what was taking place in these countries, which is why I'm keen on, you know, writing op-eds or using social media as, you know, tools to try to counter the lack of attention in mainstream media outlets and, you know, raise attention on these issues. So I think those two entwined objectives is what motivated me to, you know, address these issues. I think a third sort of, you know, broader perspective that I have that motivates me is I'm not very much of a nationalist. I kind of think of myself as being a transnationalist, and then it would be somewhat.
So you do not cherry pick the issues.
Yeah, like for me, you know, I'm American,
and we should not.
I don't think we should at all. I think any issue tied to social justice or human rights, individuals should motivate and speak up on those issues based on principle, not identity, right?
Exactly.
These aren't existentially or ego-oriented connected issues, in my opinion, right? So me being Arab of origin and being American shouldn't limit me addressing these issues only in the American context or the Arab sphere. And I'll be honest with you, I think that another motivation for me is, you know, being Arab and being Muslim being Arab American. I'm very conscious of the fact that there's a pecking order of issues that Muslims tend to focus in on, with Palestine being on top, other Arab issues being on top, and as a consequence of that, neglecting issues like Kashmir,
Uyghurs,
India,
East Turkestan.
Uyghur, exactly, all these issues. So for me, I think that maybe psychologically, being Arab, I feel a greater responsibility to speak up on these issues.
MashaAllah, that really makes you transnational then.
I try to, my best.
Alhamdulillah, and I mean a big accolade and plaudits for your work.
I appreciate that.
We have already talked about, what the world is doing against Muslim communities.
Yeah.
But let's look at our own roles as well.
Mhm.
Let's hold ourselves accountable for it as well.
Yeah.
So if I ask you, because what I see it as is that within the Muslim world as well, there are certain layers which are responsible for the apathy against these certain
Mhm.
crimes that is specifically Islamophobia
Yeah.
in the Muslim countries. If I specifically say, we have seen in the recent days that the Arab world has finally moved a little towards the blasphemy that was committed against Holy Prophet ﷺ in India by the Hindutva regime. And the Arab world has moved a little. But in general, we don't see them very responsive when it comes to Kashmir problem, East Turkestan problem, or the other problems.
Mm.
And it's just not peculiar to them. I mean, all of the Muslim governments, generally,
Yeah.
they have this apathy. Secondly, when it comes to our scholars, we rarely find scholars, addressing these issues. And thirdly, when we talk about our public, there's ignorance in our public in issues that would be transnational.
Yeah.
So I mean, you would find people in Lebanon talking about Palestine, but they don't know about Kashmir, and the other way around.
Mm-hmm.
So do you think this is not about part of a problem? This is a big problem as well.
Yeah, we look, and the reality is that, within Arab and Muslim majority societies, we have a range of converging and intersecting problems, pathologies, crises that plague our own ability to progress as a collective set of people. And I've been thinking about the Gulf states, specifically in Arab governments, speaking up against Nupur Sharma's comments against the Prophet, peace and blessings upon him. And the more and more I think about it, and the more there's been inaction by these governments in, against the very violent wake of what's taking place in recent days. We've seen the bulldozing of homes. We've seen the killing of protesters on the streets throughout India.
Yeah.
We've seen the BJP regime crack down in very violent ways against Muslims who are protesting. And this is the world's largest democracy, we thought. Should have the right to protest, but suppressing these movements in very gruesome ways. Now, I came to a very sobering conclusion in many ways that I think that, I haven't said this publicly yet, and I'm thinking about whether to say it publicly or not. I think Arab governments...
We'll make it public when you allow us.
Maybe I'll tweet about it. I think Arab governments made a statement because they took issue with the slander of the Prophet.
So,
Peace and blessings upon him, who they care about, obviously, right? Most critical figure in the religion.
or they want to reflect at least that, at least we care about this figure.
They care about the figure, they don't care about Indian Muslim lives.
True.
They care about the slander of the religion, they don't care about Uyghur lives. They care about Islam being desecrated as a faith, because that's an attack on them, but they don't care about non-Arab Muslim lives. That is one sort of, sad reality that might speak to why Arab governments are not acting on Kashmir, India, the Rohingya, the Uyghur, obviously they're not only silent, but in some respects they're acting in complicity with the governments that oppress them.
Right. I've heard you in one of the interviews talking about the solution to this Islamophobia problem. And in solutions, one of the things you propose is that there should be strategic coalitions with the marginalized groups in different communities. So that would help, like each other, and that would strengthen the cause. If I ask you a question and, just perpetuating it, or, just like, amplifying it on a bigger scale, When you think about countries and when you think about the response of Arab countries to this blasphemy against the Prophet, and you have seen that the threat of Arab countries against India of boycotting them in trade has been very effective. And that has brought India down on its knees, at least to the extent of apologizing to the outer world, no matter what they are doing inside.
But they haven't staged boycotts. They've threatened boycotts.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. You know, only threatening boycott has made them at least apologize and suspend the membership of the people who were responsible in their parties of doing that, committing that blasphemy. So do you not think, like you have talked about the coalition with the marginalized sections of the society, if these countries, Muslim countries with small economic powers, they also get together and they economically boycott or they economically strengthen each other, this would be a bigger solution to the Islamophobia problem of the West or the world. So economically
I think
strengthening each other.
Yeah, I think
economically strengthening the powers which are causing Islamophobia.
I think theoretically yes, but the reality is that Arab governments are fragmented in very problematic ways. I mean, we saw this fragmentation recently with Saudi Arabia and the UAE standing against Qatar, and so on and so forth. So if they have their own sort of like distinct divides, how can we expect them to sort of galvanize against Hindutva, violence in response to what's happening now? I think it would be a great aspiration. I mean, it's a great aspiration, right? And if that were ever to happen, those governments in the Gulf, because of their economic cachet and status, would be able, if not to slow, BJP-oriented Hindutva, because we've seen in the last couple of days. I mean, all this violence has, only raised the popularity of Modi and the BJP, right? It's not going to stop it, but it can potentially slow it, right? It could potentially sort of slow the outright violence we see, unfolding on a grand scale if they took a stance. But it's been a week now since they've issued those statements,
those threats,
and there's been no action against the physical acts of violence that are taking place.
I mean, mere threats.
Yeah, it's one thing to condemn a statement, right? But condemning and standing against violent acts is more important than condemning a statement.
True.
Yeah, because lives are actually at risk and in jeopardy in the latter instance.
Okay. Thank you very much for your thoughtful answers. We do have a lot of other questions, but let's postpone those questions till your next visit to İLKE Foundation, inshallah. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much. Thank you, brother.
Looking at the critical and contemporary issues facing the Muslim world from different perspectives, generating new ideas, bringing to you all this and a lot more in Voices from the Muslim World.